Okay, great. Hello, everybody, and welcome. And thank you so much for coming. Welcome to everybody who's watching on YouTube on the live stream. We've got, I hope we've got people from all over the place online. So my name is Liz Murray, and I'm the head of Scottish campaigns at Global Justice Now here in Scotland. Do come in. This event is part of a speaker tour that we're doing of the UK. We have another event tomorrow in Stirling, one on Saturday in Glasgow, then Manchester, Bristol, Cardiff, London. I think I've got them all right, but possibly not in the right order. Mitzi Jonelle Tan is speaking at all of those. So we want to extend her a really warm welcome. I'll introduce all our speakers properly in just a minute. But the events that we're doing in Scotland, we're doing in partnership with Friends of the Earth Scotland and with Parents for Future. And obviously Mitzi is here with us for all our events too. So as I say, I'll come back and introduce the others in a minute. But for those of you who don't know Global Justice Now, we're a social justice campaigning organisation with an international perspective, part of a global movement challenging the inequality of our current economic system, which is failing so many people here and around the world. And we campaign to make changes here that have a positive impact globally, but particularly in the global south. So we're part of a global picture of resistance and of organising for positive change. We've got an amazing network of local groups and activists, individual activists, who make sure our campaigns get seen and heard locally. Here in Dundee, we've got a lively group, some of whom are here. Actually, anyone who's in the Dundee group, do you want to just give us a wave? Great, I'll come back to you later on. So yes, we're a UK partner of the global movement that's challenging the expansion of the fossil fuels and the power of the corporations behind that. Because for too long now, the fossil fuel companies have hidden the truth about climate change. They've denied its existence. They've tried to slow action on it. They've deflected their part in the climate emergency, and they've put responsibility on reducing emissions onto us as consumers and citizens. Then they've spent billions lobbying governments to promoting false solutions. Some governments have been taken in by that and gone along with it, but others haven't. And some of those who haven't are among the world's most vulnerable countries, climate vulnerable countries. They are now calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to challenge the power of the fossil fuel companies and to provide an emergency exit plan from fossil fuels and a roadmap for a global transition away from fossil fuels that has equity and justice at its heart. So that's one that needs to take into account the workers, the communities around those workers, and the differences between countries and their contributions to climate change, and also their ability and resources to leave fossil fuels behind. So along with millions around the world, we're backing that call. And that's really what's at the heart of these events that we're running at the moment. So I want to introduce our three wonderful speakers. As I mentioned Mitzi already, Mitzi is joining us here from the Philippines, where she set up Youth Advocates for Climate Action, which is part of the Global Fridays for Future Youth Network. She's also on the steering committee of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Rosie, to her right, is the Just Transition campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland. And I'm sure you know Friends of the Earth Scotland, campaigning for environmental justice and a just transition to a fossil fuel-free Scotland. Claire is Director of Parents for Future Scotland, which is part of a global network urging change to secure a hopeful future for all children and future generations. Between them, they're going to cover, or what we'll hear about is, from Mitzi, we're going to hear about her journey to climate activism and how she's come to advocate for the fossil fuel treaty, why the treaty is an important part of a global transition away from fossil fuels, and also the crucial part that the global civil society movement that we're a part of can play. We're going to hear from Rosie about the just transition away from fossil fuels and what that here in Scotland and what that should look like. And from Claire, we're going to hear about the impacts of burning fossil fuels, how those impacts are felt locally. including here in Dundee, and how that links to the bigger picture of the fossil fuel treaty. Then I'm just going to finish up. We'll have some, as I mentioned, we'll have time for questions and comments. And I'll finish up with things that we can do here in Scotland. And those of you that are in the room, please do also stay afterwards, have a look at the materials on the stalls and chat to anyone, any of us that you'd like to, and we've got drinks and nibbles upstairs as well. So, hello, do come in, welcome. Hi. Hello, gosh, there's a bus just arrived. No, that's the point. Okay. So first of all, then I'm going to hand to Mitzi, who's going to kick us off. So thanks very much, Mitzi.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here. And as I speak now, my country is being hit by typhoon, or I think it's internationally something, where over 2 million people have been affected already. Better? Is that better? Hello? Yeah.
I think that's better, Mitzi, yeah.
Hello? Hello.
That's good. Yeah.
So I'll say it again. As I speak now, my country is being hit by Typhoon Christine, where over 2 million people are being affected. And the rains have still been going on, the flooding has been getting worse. And it's often around the areas where there are quarrying and mining sites and other deforestation sites owned by multinational corporations. And a lot of times when we talk to the people and when we go to the communities that have been affected who are relief operations, we ask them, how do you feel about what's been happening? And there's been a real shift over the years that we've existed as a group, where before they would say that it was a natural disaster caused by God. The Philippines is also a very Catholic country for the most part. And now recently it has shifted in the sense that they see that something's wrong, that this isn't something that happened before and it's gotten more and more intense. And we try to tell them something that I feel like a lot of us here are familiar with, that these aren't natural disasters anymore. It's man-made, but not just made by any man, but by multinational corporations, by this imperialist system. There's a reason why we are in a climate crisis. The crisis doesn't just come from the extreme weather events, it's also how our countries in the global south aren't able to bounce back after. We're not able to really recuperate our the places where we have our evacuation centers aren't real evacuation centers. They're churches, they're schools, they're gyms. We don't have infrastructure to be climate resilient. Because a lot of the resources that's going into it is to protect the fossil fuel industries. And that's also why we have a climate crisis. And so this is a part of the reason why I became a climate activist, because it's something that faces us every single day. And I grew up with it, really seeing the destruction and how it's changed over the years. But also being able to talk to our indigenous peoples in the Philippines and them telling us about how they're being harassed and displaced and militarized, all for protecting their land. And so that is the context and the backdrop of climate activism, environmental activism in the Philippines that's heavily militarized. And there you also see again the link of fossil fuel industries and militarization, where so much money goes into fossil fuel industries, so much money goes into subsidies, and not going into social services for people, not going into climate action, and so much money is going to militarization instead of social services, instead of things that will actually protect us in the long run. And that's all a bit heavy. And that was what I was carrying with me when I first went to COP26 in Glasgow. So that was the last time and the first time that I was here in Scotland. And it was my first UN climate conference. And I came with hope, with expectations rather. And I came out of it incredibly disappointed and heartbroken, really. And I remember seeing the final talk text and just crying and thinking they were there debating a certain word or two, not realizing that the words that are debating around the fossil fuel industry means the lives of people today. That it's not just words on a piece of paper that they announce in the end, but it's the lives of people and how it's affecting everyone, especially families, communities, actual people. And a few months after that, I think, is when I was introduced to the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And what the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's a long name, so I'll be calling it the treaty from now on, provides is really a concrete pathway to achieve the Paris Agreement or to achieve actually the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that we have. It means that we have the non-proliferation of fossil fuel industry. It means that we have a phase out and we have a global just transition. And this felt like something actually concrete for me to hold on to, for me to actually campaign towards, that feels doable, that feels actionable, and that feels within my reach. Because countries were already signing on. Now we have around 14 countries, mostly in the Pacific, but now also some in Southeast Asia and Latin America. And it's so exciting because we finally see that just like the way that the Landmines Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty were being formed, which is what this treaty is patterned off of, we're seeing a pathway out of this fossil-free world. But the next question is, how do you make sure that it's a justice world, a world that's oriented actually on justice and not just outside of fossil fuels, but really not just a transition from energy, but a transition to a world that makes sure that no one is left behind.
Thank you, Mitzi. We're going to come back to Mitzi again, actually, later in the panel. So now I'm going to hand over to Rosie from Frenzy Scotland.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosie and I'm the Just Transition campaigner at Frenzy Scotland. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the work that we've been doing, mainly in Scotland, but a bit across the UK as well, to organise around the Just Transition, and hopefully kind of drawing out some global links that as well to that work too. But just to give a bit of context, so Frenzy Scotland campaigns for a fast and fair transition away from oil and gas that is led by their workers and communities towards publicly owned renewable energy sources. We organise on the basis that it's system change that's needed rather than climate-based reforms of the way things currently are. Environmental and social harms are caused by the extractive policies of governments in the global north, while workers and communities in the global south and here in Scotland disproportionately face the destructive consequences. So we operate within that context. I feel like it's a very knowledgeable audience here tonight, but just to kind of do my usual spiel on just transition as a concept, it is about both the process and the delivery of the energy transition. It is procedurally just to have workers in high carbon industries involved in co-designing the plans for their workplace transitions, scaling that up to both the sectoral and regional level across offshore oil and gas, onshore, transport, agriculture. Every sector should be thinking kind of proactively about this, and it should come from workers who have the experience and expertise to lead that. It should simultaneously involve community buy-in, recognising and valuing those communities that have basically scaffolded the oil and gas sector for its entire existence and propped it up essentially through other jobs, the care economy, etc. But this presentation starts a bit critical, a bit depressing, but it'll get a bit better. In Scotland so far, the story has been one of market dominance with next to no public control or ownership, which has meant that the benefits of the energy transition have been largely privatised as a result here. Some of you might have heard of the kind of long forgotten just transition plans that the Scottish Government were meant to come out with, whether it's the energy strategy or just transition plan for Grangemouth or the transport sector. Each one has been delayed and they're pretty much missing in action. In their place, the same energy companies that have made millions off of the energy and cost of living crises are the same ones that are being given free rein to dictate the pace and the terms of the energy transition. If we want to look at one of the key battlegrounds, or some would argue the key litmus test of the just transition in Scotland, we just need to look at Grangemouth, where 500 jobs at the refinery are set to be decimated, with thousands more, at risk in the supply chain. And the Scottish Government have done a little more than kind of wash their hands of it and say, well, that's INEOS's commercial decision, which is quite a mocking statement, really, given that they knew of INEOS's plans to convert the refinery in April of 2022, 18 months before INEOS made their announcement to the press. So the fact that there is still a Grangemouth just transition plan in the ether and not in tangible reality when they've had longer than anybody else, arguably apart from INEOS, to get ahead of this is pretty embarrassing. What's more, ever since the announcement, they've continued to give INEOS over £400,000 of public money since, and they're in further talks to discuss more government grants through Scottish Enterprise, with no conditionality on creating jobs, protecting their current workforce, or giving back to the community of Grangemouth. So it's just lots of these private companies being allowed to act with impunity and essentially do business as usual. I watched the inquiry where INEOS sat and gave evidence to what the closure of the refinery meant, and they were keen to stress nothing would change for their customer base. Everybody would be getting the same refined product, because all that's happening is that emissions are offshored and the workers are losing their jobs. And if this wasn't enough, one of our core campaigns is in Peterhead, where they are actively considering expanding onshore oil. Sorry, I should say the Scottish Government are actively considering expanding onshore oil and gas infrastructure by considering SSE and Equinor, our least favourite body, I was going to say favourite body, you take that any which way, application to build a new gas-fired power station in Peterhead. It would be complete with the dodgy technology that is carbon capture, use and storage, which is consistently overpromised and under-delivered across the globe, with 80% of large-scale CCS projects either cancelled or put on hold. In Peterhead, the jobs figures are estimated to be at the new power station. They're actually looking like it will be a 30% reduction in jobs in comparison to the existing plant. So that's really piercing the myth that CCS is going to bring more jobs to any given area. And SSE themselves admit that 75% of the construction jobs needed to build the new power station would go to people outside of the Aberdeenshire area. So it's hardly a just transition for people in the local communities who've been vastly underserved by public infrastructure cuts and are dying for good jobs that are sustainable, that stay there for the long term. Instead of this kind of picture of corporate dominance, we really need to see concrete industrial policies instead that have been born out of the work of the trade union movement and the climate movement supporting them. At Friends Here Scotland platform, who are kind of a collaborative organisation in London, we've been organising on the foundations of the Our Power Report, where offshore oil and gas workers came together to create 10 demands for the energy transition. And a few weeks ago, we were outside the Treasury in London demanding 1.9 billion out of the upcoming UK Labour budget for a ring-fence funding package to create jobs, upgrade our ports, and create targeted retraining funds for oil and gas workers. And we were keen to make clear to them that 1.9 billion is nothing in comparison to the 40 billion in post-tax profits the oil and gas companies made in the UK in 2022 and 2023. So on the whole, this means transforming the way the transition has been managed so far, and massively redirecting it. Instead of leaving the energy transition in Peterhead across Scotland, across the UK to private companies, our governments have the potential to take transformative action around energy generation and ownership. It just needs the political will to do it. Local public ownership of local generation of energy could play a substantial role in ensuring numbers of jobs are actually created. And for example, somewhere like the northeast of Scotland benefits from closer to 27,000 new jobs in genuinely clean energy, rather than 50 CCS jobs at one plant that will never materialise. And it's in their interest to do so, given that private generation and financing of energy, as we know, is already pretty heavily dependent on public money, such as through subsidies. So we need to, if we increase public spending, but keep it within public and community control at the local and community level, communities can actually retain say over how the benefits of the energy transition are distributed, investing in local jobs, not even just in the energy sector, and reinvesting back into crucial public services. And simultaneously, while this is going on, it has to be rooted in the principles of a global just transition that actually accounts for how the resources we need for building wind turbines and other green technologies are acquired. We've done research to show that transition minerals such as lithium and steel are vital to the energy transition away from fossil fuels. But if Scotland doesn't consider core principles of reducing demand for these minerals, that will compromise the aims of the transition and essentially reinforce the global harms that are done to places like the Philippines and elsewhere where those minerals are extracted from, where, you know, labour rights abuses, environmental destruction are endemic. So if we call ourselves, you know, kind of in solidarity with workers and trade unions, then that has to extend to a global basis as well and not perpetuate global climate injustice. And the Scottish Government could do much more to ensure that due diligence happens across their supply chain so that that global picture is much better and just as well. And just to conclude, I think as kind of climate activists here today, we have to stand as workers and communities across the world, across the climate movement and trade union, demanding that our governments turn the tide of the energy transition away from the market and towards the people, pushing them to sign up to the treaty, showing up at demonstrations in Grangemouth and elsewhere, and fighting for a vision of public and community-owned energy.
Thank you. That was a great way of showing how interconnected all these issues are. And now I'm going to hand to Claire from Parents for Future, who's going to talk about the same kind of thing, but from a slightly different angle.
Hi, so I'm Claire, and yeah, I'm from Parents for Future Scotland. Yeah, community energy is one of my most favourite things. After last weekend, I went to a Scotland bike gathering, and I've just not been able to stop talking about it, so it's lovely to hear about it. So Parents for Future Scotland create accessible ways for parent communities to raise their voices together so that no one stands alone in tackling the symptoms of perpetuating climate change. So we're really a grassroots group of parents that support each other to have a voice on climate matters. And we're a global movement. So inspired by Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement, Parents for Future started, and we are across the world. And I'm one of the co-founders and director of Parents for Future Scotland. And if you met me 4 years ago, you think I was an extremely unlikely candidate to be starting a movement. I was not climate concerned. I thought that this was other people's responsibility and it wasn't mine, and it would get sorted. And I thought, to be honest, the climate predictions seemed pretty dramatic, you know, and everyone was just getting a wee bit stressed about nothing. And then lockdown happens, and I realised that our systems are interconnected and things can break down very, very quickly. I thought that my children were having a really poor standard of living, and it was actually that started to motivate me to think about their future and what I could do for them. So I felt like I had a moral obligation to act and do something. So I got together some friends and asked, and we all put out a message just to ask who could come together. And in our first meeting, we had 40 people, many of which are now trustees. And over the time, they taught me that actually, you know, climate and social justice are interconnected, and that, you know, climate is actually, like, the climate crisis is happening right now, affecting the global south, and, you know, that's what we really need to fight for. And this is now my motivation, and it's much nicer, much more expansive than kind of the anxiety around K9. So we support action on climate and social justice. We aim to reach all members of society who are kind of acknowledging that the climate movement is not very diverse at the moment, and we want to build a really diverse movement and have lots of different voices. And we have 3 key programmes, which are flexible climate talks, air pollution in schools, and anti-oil campaigning. So I had the pleasure of going along to a flexible climate talk in Glasgow last week, and it was a Milk Cafe, which works with migrant communities. And I was sat in a room with 15 women from across the globe talking about how the climate crisis was affecting them. And I heard stories from Uganda and deforestation. I heard stories about Syria and the war that was happening, and flooding and overheating in Pakistan. It was incredibly powerful to be in a room with these women, and they had brilliant stories to share. And we all shared that we felt fear, but we also felt a shared sense of humanity and empowerment by being there and sharing these stories together. When I started talking about campaigning, I was really sad to hear from them. They told me that nobody wants to hear from us. We're not voices that people want to hear from. And I just think, well, you know, systemically, that's exactly what they're told, isn't it? These women are put into hotels. They don't have any means to cook for themselves. They can be moved at any instant. They can't put down roots. They're given £8.86 per day to live off of. They can cost £5 to travel in a bus in Glasgow in one day. And they will be facing microaggressions in their interactions every single day. So we are really passionate about being able to tell these stories and giving these women the tools to tell these stories because I feel that the systemic oppressions that they face are the systemic oppressions that lead to climate change. And if we can empower these women, then we can empower ourselves to tackle climate change. So I'm just so aware that, you know, I'm here today telling their stories, and the next time I'm asked to talk, I really hope that it's not me, but it is one of these women. They're incredible. So our air pollution programme is in schools in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And why air pollution? Yeah. Well, I'm going to air pollution is pretty prevalent in Scotland, but obviously it's invisible. And I'm going to do a little air pollution quiz. There's no prizes, so just go for it. So, in Dundee, one person a day, a week, or a month dies as a direct result of air pollution. Who thinks a day? Hands up. Who thinks a week? Who thinks a month? Okay, brilliant. Well, it is a week actually. It's about 6.5 days. Every 6.5 days, someone dies as a direct result of air pollution in Dundee. In a study in Midwest Hospital, they had higher hospital admissions linked to high air pollution levels for which demographic? Was it children, the elderly, or pregnant women? Who thinks children? Okay. Who thinks the elderly? Okay. Who thinks pregnant women? Okay. I think there's quite good press coverage on that. People seem to know that. So yeah, so it was actually linked to children. Children have small lungs and they breathe quickly. So it means that it really badly affects them, but it also affects elderly pregnant women inevitably as well. So that this study was usually done on hospital admissions for children. Dundee has the lowest, the third lowest, or the fifth lowest car ownership rates in Scotland. Who thinks the lowest? The third lowest. The fifth lowest. Okay, so it's the third lowest actually, and they have the third lowest rate of car ownership. So that it just goes to show that sometimes air pollution is a social justice issue. Often those areas with low car ownership actually are the most exposed to air pollution and because they're near busy roads. And so we go into schools and we give education packs to teachers and we do payment talks to parents. Now the education packs and the payment talks allow children and parents to explore air pollution and its effects and what they can do about it within their local school communities and what they can do about it at a legislative level. So as I said, we deliver the payment talks, and to be honest, none of the parents that come are there because they're interested in air pollution or climate. They're actually there because their child is going to come in for 5 minutes and do a little presentation to them, and they don't want their child to be the only one in the room that doesn't have somebody there. So, and when you start talking about climate, you can see that people are really kind of feeling blamed and shamed. They don't really want to open up about it, but we take an hour and a half, we create a really warm, connecting space, and we start talking about structural changes, you know. So what if it was free joined up public transport across Glasgow? What would that feel like? Or what if we had a paid person that could support children to actively get to and from school? Would that help you out, you know? And you can see people going from this blame and shame to actually starting to feel empowered. And we find that a third of parents join our group having had a talk. So it just goes to show the power of talking to people. And once parents join our group, it's not a massive leap to go from air pollution to start to think about anti-oil campaigning. As Five has said, we did our programme last year, what happens in my 2 homes in Glasgow, Pakistan are not unrelated. And she was talking about the car fumes that come out when she goes to drop off her kids, and how she talks to the family in Pakistan, and those fumes are contributing to the overheating and flooding that she hears about every single day. So we support Warless Winter, Stop Rosebank, Peterhead, and Fossil Fuel Duty. Although any other ones, I'm sure they're behind them as well, if there's any other campaigns. So they, and you know, it's very clear that our over-reliance on fossil fuels is just not working for us. So we are paying about 65% more than we were a couple of years ago. Around about half of the households in the UK will be rationing energy use this year. A quarter of Scottish families have struggled to feed their children or give them sufficient food, according to Bernardo's. And almost 2 million people in the UK have said that they are not going to turn on their heating at all this winter. And last year it was 1 million, so that's doubled. And when you contrast that, the oil and gas industry has generated 2.3 billion profit per day in the last 50 years. And we also get 16 billion in subsidies. Poverty is a political choice. It's really, really clear. When there's a 700 million pound windfall tax that is being untouched, and yet there's so many cuts that are happening in our own community. That is a political choice, and it doesn't have to be that way. So our aim is that Scotland is one of the first oil-rich nations to transit. And we want a just transition as the fossil fuel treaty is asking for. So we want it to be worker-led in the UK, and it obviously needs to happen on a worldwide stage. If it doesn't happen on a worldwide stage, then it leaves the door wide open for rich countries to continue to blame others for their high emissions and to pretend that we're not, that we have magic technology that will store carbon. So we love the fossil fuel treaty, and because we feel that it really brings local and national and global together. So we local people, as well as office bearers, councillors, MPs, MSPs, and world leaders, can all ask for a transition away from fossil fuels. And the thing is that I talked about these women at the start, and I said how they face like systems of oppression every single day. And I'm sure that most women in this room don't face the level of systemic oppression that these women have faced. However, I do also want to say that we all do face systemic oppression in terms of budget cuts, cost of living crisis, long-term effects of lockdown, and just constant messages that we have no power and we have no money, which is propagated by those that have power and money. So what I want to say today is that we do have power, and I think that standing together, we can tackle air pollution in our cities, we can tackle systemic oppressions that asylum seekers face in this country, and we can absolutely phase out fossil fuels worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for drawing all that together so brilliantly. I'm going to hand back to Mitzi to, you conclude as you want to.
Thank you. I think both Rosie and Claire painted a really good picture of from local to national to regional and to global even. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to remember that we are an ecosystem of activists as well, an ecosystem of change makers, just the way that nature is an ecosystem as well. There's this really powerful quote by Lila Watson, who's an Aboriginal furry activist from Australia, who says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that's what we need to remember when we're tackling the global crises that we're facing, not just the climate crisis, because really the climate crisis is a symptom of this rotten colonial imperialist system that we have. And I think that's why we've led to the climate crisis, because of the profit-oriented system that has no regard for people or nature or commons or the planet. And so really, we analyze where they get their power, and as you were saying, they keep telling us that we're powerless, that they have all the power. Where does the power come from? It comes from the workers, it comes from the land, it comes from the resources, which they do not actually own. They say they own it, but who actually has it is the people. And so it's about reclaiming our power and understanding that a global transition, a just transition, isn't just about energy, but about reclaiming and transitioning that power from them to us. And that's going to be a long, long, long journey, and it's going to be incredibly difficult, but there have already been so many victories, and there have already been so many small victories that have led up to bigger victories. Something that Rebecca Solnit, who is a wonderful author, had mentioned is that just a few years ago, it was impossible to imagine that renewable energy would be cheaper than fossil fuels. And now it is quite close. And so a lot of it is about understanding how much we can imagine, how creative we can think and get out of the narrative that the system is telling us that we are alone, that we are powerless, that what happens in one country does not affect the other. But the reality is that when we come together, when we have that international solidarity, that's when they're most scared. And the beautiful thing is you don't really need to add another thing because your local campaigning already helps what's happening in the Philippines or what's happening across the world. Because especially in a country like Scotland,
Yeah.
yeah. Especially in a country like Scotland, which is one of the major oil-rich nations, there's a lot of power there, and a lot of strength that's reclaimed in that. If the fossil fuel industries here are stopped, if the extractive industries here are stopped, and if workers here are listened to, and it sets a precedent, precedent across the world. And I remember at COP26 in Glasgow, one of the only good news that I heard at that time was that Scotland was the first nation to give a loss and damage to give to the loss and damage fund in the form of grants and not loans, which is so crucial and so important. And is already such a big step because it's like, hey, look at this nation who's not the biggest, who's not the richest, but they're doing the right thing and they're listening to their people. And there's so much strength and power in that. And there's so much strength and power in this treaty in the sense that now, and it's true, it hasn't been written yet. And that's a good thing because that means we can write it together. That means that people coming into the movement now, into the treaty now, have a chance to directly influence the government treaty that's being written mostly by the Pacific. And if we get Scotland in there, then hopefully with a Labour government, you guys will be able to at least leverage that. Because something that I've seen happen is that, you know, my government's not gonna listen to me. But maybe they'll listen to the government of the Marshall Islands, or they'll listen to the government of Colombia. And the people in the Pacific have a good relationship with their government, more or less, on this topic of fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel treaty. And so feeding it and connecting to the movement there, I have found that I've been able to leverage some connections with climate activists through the treaty from the Pacific to talk to, and they talk to their ministers, and then they talk to our policymakers in the Philippines, and it has done things to change. And so I think that's also the power of the global movement. We see that the corporations, the militarization, the imperialist countries, really, they're all collaborating, they're all working together. All the decisions aren't actually being made at the conferences, they're being made in dinner tables, they're being made in probably like yacht club parties or whatever, wherever they go to. So we should be doing the same, not the yacht club parties, but collaborating and seeing where we can cause trouble. In every space of the globe, in every way that we can, in the small and the big ways, because that is where the power really is.
Thank you to all three. Yep, let's create trouble. That sounds good. Beautiful trouble. Okay. There's 22 people online, which is great. I just want to give you 2 or 3 minutes to reflect on what you've just heard and maybe turn to somebody beside you and just anything that's particularly struck you. And also just to give you a chance to think about any questions or comments that you'd like to make, which we'll move on to in a minute. And for the folks who are on YouTube, if you want to submit a question, you can do it in the comments, right? In the comments underneath. And so we're going to keep the folk who are online, we're going to keep you here for another 10 minutes for the Q&A after we've had a couple of minutes reflection. Then we're going to say goodbye to you and we'll carry on it in the room. So yeah, just a couple of minutes of turning to someone nearby and just something that struck you about what you heard or any thoughts that it triggered for you. Too long so that we've got enough time for everybody to say what they want to. So the question that's coming in from the live stream is about, oh, there's more than one question, but anyway, have there been any climate wins in the Philippines?
Good question. Yes and no. So we have had a coal moratorium, that has since been my English is like
Undone.
undone. And so yes and no. We've had really amazing community blockage of large scale mining company that lasted for months and months and months. And I see this as a win, even if it's been changed since then. Even if it's been overturned since then, because the months that it happened, it still organized a lot of people and also just concretely stopped a lot of months of that destruction. And now they're having to do a little bit less of that. So there are some reasons in that sense. I will say that under the current government, it's incredibly slow and difficult. On paper, it sounds really good because he claims to be a climate leader, but he is, for context, the son of our dictator from 50 years ago. And so a lot of his family and his legacy is a lot of corruption, human rights abuse, and that's happening more and more now in the Philippines, especially in rural areas. There's a lot of bombings of indigenous schools and activist areas, and a lot of activists are being abducted by the military. But a victory, I would say now, is there's these two young women, Jedda and Janina Castro, who were abducted by the military last September. And the military had told them that they had sent out a press release to the world that they were rebel surrenderies. And then at the press conference, they bravely said that, hey, actually, they made us sign that confession in a military camp under duress, and we were actually abducted. And successfully, through also large mobilizations outside of the press conference, they're now out of custody of the military, but they are facing charges. But they are gaining a lot of like international and national support to make sure that they're kept safe. And I think that's a massive victory.
Thank you. Right, let's take one from the room then. Anybody? Just completely the other side. I'll come up now.
Hi, so my question is, how will the transition away from fossil fuels be affected by advancements in technology such as generative AI? Because obviously they use a lot of power to keep running, but also they take a lot of water out of the natural water cycle and stuff. And so I was just wondering how the inequality caused by them, but also like how fossil fuels and stuff comes into them, like how that will affect the sort of movement and away from fossil fuels.
Thank you. Let's answer that, and then there's one more online before we finish that. I'm looking at you, Rosie.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're totally right. That, like, these technologies in and of themselves, and I'm worried I'm going to sound a bit old and dinosaurish because I'm maybe there is a good argument for how they can be used ethically in some instances, but for the more that I don't know any of that, so if somebody has a more nuanced view than me, but in general, as you say, they use so much power and they use so much water to function in ways that generally like human labor can replicate. So like why, and it kind of comes back to that principle of demand reduction, of why are we creating extra demand on these resources to power something like ChatGPT when like and all of our kind of organic sectors that would do the sorts of labor that's trying to replicate, generally creative sectors as well, like for art and music and storytelling, that it could be a job for somebody. That could be somebody's livelihood who's probably underpaid and in general, and you know, replicating that labor through something that has a very exploitative and extractive system at the heart. I think that's another background, and I don't know. It's not a conversation that we've had internally at Frontier Scotland beyond probably what you've kind of drawn attention to, and I don't know. It would be good to know who is tackling that question, because I think it's something that's kind of the rug is getting pulled out from under us a little bit. Like I feel like I kind of can't keep up with it very much because it's just kind of exploded onto the scene as a kind of tech that's very, very creepy and normalized now, when really, as you say, underpinning it, there's a lot of stuff that ethically and from a climate justice perspective we should be very much against. But yeah, that is just kind of riffing, so I don't know if there's like a movement against it, I could be completely ignorant as well.
I'm not sure there's a whole movement against it specifically, but it definitely goes back to that anti-corporate thing that we're talking about, where technically, if you really think about it, you could have AI be okay, but it's because they're producing it and pushing it out at this rate of for profit, essentially. And the same people who are looking into AI and to these technological advancements and into going to another planet, really, are also the same people trying to go into carbon capture and technology and geoengineering. It's these billionaires who don't want to address that there is a climate crisis here. And so, in a sort of twisted way, the way to organize against that is also just whatever organizing that goes against billionaires and their corporations, and that inadvertently affects them, right? I think they're seeing that this planet and their consequences are coming up to them, and so now they need to find all these technological reasons and things to look into, and that's their new future that they're building. So let's battle it by building our own future.
Thank you. I'm going to take one online, the other one that's come in from online. How would a Trump presidency impact climate justice? Mitzi, will I continue?
I want to start by saying I hate talking about US politics, and
You can be brief then. Me too.
also know that it doesn't affect everyone in the world because they are such a huge and privileged country, especially in countries that you multiple things that I think you all probably know. You know, he's a climate denier. We've seen what the Trump presidency looks like. But I think a very pressing issue right now is what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza, where Netanyahu wants a Trump presidency. And the loads of money that's going into military aid in Gaza, and there is an oil and gas strip there if you need a climate connection for this, it's just destroying so much of people's lives and the planet, and it's not just Gaza. The US is funding military in the Philippines, the US is funding military in conflict areas in Balochistan, in Sudan, in Congo, in West Papua. They're everywhere. And so I wouldn't necessarily say Harris is getting better. But Trump is definitely worse. And ideally, maybe you're able to organize US people if you're online. You're able to organize a little bit more under a non-Trump presidency than a Trump presidency.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, here in the room, there's one down here, Jane, and then let's go.
I just wonder if you could give us a very, very brief summary of the repressive measures faced by climate activists in the Philippines.
Yeah. Can we just take, we'll take that one, another one together.
Oh, right, you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, this is actually building on the mother parents. What's your name?
Here's from Future Scotland.
Right, there. Okay, and also your stats in terms of you know, children, young people and the fumes, etc. Well, I actually am part of the Dundee Cycling Forum, and what we are trying to do is encourage people to get on their bikes and to cut back on all the toxic fumes that are in the city. But we're doing this, we're not the only city that's doing it. You know, Glasgow, Edinburgh, all across the country, all across Europe, people are doing that. And we're trying to really encourage the council, and it's very slow because Dundee's actually a bit slow in the uptake. But you know, encourage them to build cycling internets, not internets, you know what I mean, infrastructure, network, infrastructure within the city, so that people with disability, people with wheelchairs, people that can actually get out into the city and cycle down to the waterfront and feel safe on their bikes, on their disabilities bikes, and you know, feel free to cycle. But that's what we feel would help bring down, you know, the the fumes, etc. But we do feel that if people get used to using low carbon vehicles, you know, then that's one way of encouraging climate change and moving people out of getting used to driving cars. And we feel that people need to get away from dependency on cars and lorries and start using, you know, in public transport, that kind of thing, as we do in Europe. That's my contribution. But others, yeah.
I mean, I could just go into.
Yeah. So there wasn't a question in there, was there?
Oh, sorry,
It
no,
doesn't
that's
matter. You don't have to have a question. I just
Well, no,
wanted to make
that's
sure I
fine.
hadn't missed it.
Other than the, how does that fit into the grand scheme? But
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So we'll go in, River. We'll take yours first, and then we'll move to Philippines after that.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much. I mean, parents and children, so yeah, we do support cycling in Glasgow. We have a bi-monthly bike ride that runs for families at Strong, Glasgow City Centre and back. And we run information evenings on setting up bike buses and walking buses. And we work with Women on Wheels and Sunny Cycles. Sunny Cycles does adapted bikes for people that need them, and Women on Wheels works with lots of different communities to get women up and running on bikes. That's what it says in the tin. And then yes, with the children and parents voted for measures that they wanted to see enacted at a legislative level last year in Glasgow, and one of the things that they voted for was cycling infrastructure that was joined up across the city. And there is actually a plan for that in Glasgow, but it is under threat, obviously, with the cuts. So we have tried to kind of support the consultations on that and say that we are very for that. So yeah, and cycling is definitely a big part of that, and I love cycling personally. Yeah.
On the Philippines, there are different ways. So the most obvious one is the militarization and the tagging of activists as terrorists. So our last president, President Duterte, who's also a horrible president. They're all pretty bad, but set up the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, which is really just an excuse to tag anyone fighting for human rights as a rebel or as a communist armed terrorist. Because there is a civil war happening in the Philippines where we do have a communist insurgency, mostly led by farmers and workers, but mostly farmers and indigenous peoples in the rural areas. But the government has been using that now as an excuse to target anyone who fights for human rights. And that means bombing indigenous schools. So we have our indigenous peoples, the Lumad people from Mindanao, which is the southern part of the Philippines. And they don't have schools in their areas, in their ancestral land. So they set up their own schools, which are, I think our school systems can learn from their school systems. That when they teach math, they teach about when they teach about fractions, they teach about land and how they cut up land because they're farmers. When they teach about values, they teach about their indigenous values and sovereignty and ancestral land. And so that the government was said that's a threat to the system, that's a threat to multinational companies, that's a threat to profit. So we're going to bomb those schools, we're going to close them down. Activists are there's also a law that was set up in 2020, which before the 2020 it already existed, but it's just gotten even more has more teeth now, the anti-terror law, which means that you can be surveilled without you knowing, which means that you can be arrested without a warrant. It means that you can basically be tagged as a terrorist if they suspect that you have an intention to do something. And it's all decided by that national task force and local. And then on the other side, we also have police and military going around schools, especially public schools and marginalized areas, doing talks in the schools saying, if you become a policeman or a military man, you get money, you get incentives, and also don't joining these groups or doing grassroots activism because they're terrorists and they're horrible and they literally edit people's faces and even Congress people's faces who are more progressive to have these symbols on their face and be and horns and literally it's very childish, I think. And that means that it also permeates within people's everyday thinking. A lot of even my family members, my extended family will think, oh, Mitzi, as a joke, ha ha ha, Mitzi, you're the activist, you're the terrorist. And it's like, to casually just say that and to think that it's okay, that it's so normal, but it has become normalized because of the way that the government media, their social media, they also have a paid troll farm that just goes off into the different social media sites to bring out these thoughts. So those are the different levels and layers of repression. And then you can also just be abducted and killed by paramilitary or military, if it's in defense of usually in the rural areas with mining companies and landlords. And by landlords, I mean we still have families and individuals who own like huge parts of land, like bigger than several provinces in the Philippines. And so they have a lot of the local power.
Thank you. I'm just so we're going to say goodbye to the folk who are on the live stream. Rick, did you get in the comments on YouTube? You'll see a link to a petition. If you're in Scotland and you're on the live stream and you haven't already signed our petition to the First Minister on the Fossil Fuel Treaty, please do. You can also go to our website, globaljustice.org.uk/Scotland, and you'll be able to find out more information about what's going on here in Scotland if you don't already, if you're not already on our email list. And so we're going to say thanks very much to the folk on YouTube for being with us, and goodbye for now. And then we're going to carry on here in the room.